I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. On the Greek island of Lesbos in Greece's Moria refugee camp. A camp which Doctors Without Borders describe as horrific and inhumane. That's not what one would expect to be associated with a camp which is supposed to shelter and provide people relief from danger. So on today's show, we try to understand what exactly is happening on the Moria refugee camp and what is life like for the over 19,000 refugees that are living there. Joining us for this discussion is Alireza Yasa, who is a refugee and human rights activist. He joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us is Mr. Adrian Pereira, Director of North-South Initiative, an initiative based in Malaysia to help bridge the solidarity of both places in terms of human rights. He joins us from Kuala Lumpur. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to this show. Mr. Alireza Yasa, I'd like to begin with you. Now, you have been covering refugee rights and the issue of refugees for a very long time and very extensively. Now, the Moria camp here in Greece is considered to be one of the most hellish sort of camps in Europe. Why do you think that is?
Thank you, Meshal. It's very good to talk about the issue that it's a kind of human rights crisis in the world, in Europe, a part of the Europe. The Moria camp in Lesbos place in Greece. It's a place made, think like this, a place made for 2,500 people, a camp for 2,500 refugees, but there is around 20,000 people are living in that place. It's a crisis. It's a kind of human rights crisis. Why? Because there is no electricity, there is no hot water, there is no place to go for bath, there is no bathroom, there is no place for making rest the people. Also, there is a lack of facilities like the place for children, the school, the hospitals. Nothing is there. Even there is no a clinic for refugees to go for health issues, for some reasons, for women especially. Nothing. They are living in a place like a prison that they do not have access to any facilities of living. Right. For example, they are staying in a line with 5,000 people to take a little food. They are staying in a line with 1,000 people for going to a bathroom. That's why this place is right. Not. We are calling that there is a prison right. With no human rights.
Mr. Yasa, stay with me. Stay with me on that essential point. Now, you mentioned a number of factors that go on here, and this has been one of the main issues of this camp, that it doesn't provide the basic facilities which are required for a livable situation. But to understand really what refugee camps are supposed to provide, I'm going to take this to Mr. Adrian Pereira. Mr. Adrian Pereira, what are the basic facilities and necessities that should be provided to refugees which are housed in shelters?
So refugees are supposed to be given their basic rights, fundamental rights to food, healthcare, housing, shelter, and unfortunately, what has happened, if you look at the condition of the camps, the refugee camp, it looks more like a detention camp. So the governments are trying to punish, make conditions extremely hard, not in the sense of providing rights or a temporary shelter, but to discourage. So this negativity and the harsh conditions are done on purpose, created to ensure as a warning to other refugees and asylum seekers.
But doesn't this seem to be a failure? This strategy, doesn't it seem to be a failure because people who are coming don't really have a choice?
Yeah, so the question has to be beyond the status of the refugee camp. It has to be about the political will of all countries at the national level, at the regional level, and even global level. How are they going to manage and solve the root causes of the problem And actually, if you look at the Global Compact on refugees, studying the root cause is actually one of the very important elements which will prevent conflict. But unfortunately, it looks like nobody is following this.
Right. Mr. Yasa, agree with Mr. Pereira there when he says that the conditions of these camps, or this camp specifically, are intentionally horrible to ensure that people don't come for refuge in the first place.
Actually, I'm aware of the Global Compact, what the UNHCR and all the countries who are participated in last December, they agreed to make some kind of ways, rules to make the refugees' life better. But in Moria, especially in Moria, if we talk about this, we are talking about the horrible situation of the humans being in a crisis. Man, woman, children, disables, paralysis, all are in a place like a prison. Even they do not have access to the clean water. They do not have access to small fundamental facilities in this place. But in this situation, all the organizations, international organizations, the European Union representative, the European countries representative, like bigger organizations, they are coming, they are seeing, and they know, they are watching what's going on there, but no one is care about it. They say that these all are about the rules of the Greece country. The country must be care about this, but even the UNHCR, the international organizations, are not care about the situation of the refugees.
Have you seen a precedent? Do you, Mr. Yasa, when you're saying that international organizations don't care about the situation here, other countries don't care about the situation, specifically in this camp, do we have a precedent of sorts in which international organizations did play a more vital role in trying to alleviate people from their horrible conditions in refugee camps from other places in the world?
Of course. The UNHCR is responsible to be care about the refugees' fundamental problems like living issues, like making the residency cards or something, some documentation for them. That's for the first time. It's getting the responsibility by the government of Greece. But in second hand, they must be care about the refugees' life, fundamental facilities like living, like having a shelter, having access to the healthcare. Everything is made decision by only by rules. They are only written on the paper. But no one
There's no enforcement. There's no enforcement there, right? Mr. Adrian Pereira, following from Mr. Yasa is talking about here, the fact that there is a responsibility on part of international organizations as well to take a stand. Now, the Greek government has been vocal about the fact that until other EU members don't share the burden of these refugees, they really can't do anything more. Is this a point in which the UNHCR should be intervening?
See, the UNHCR is a very bureaucratic organization which will still have to adhere to the political decisions of its members. So in that sense, it's very limited. Unless there's real strong leadership within UNHCR, and currently, I think it's very limited, and it's only when the governments make commitments together with the international organizations can we find some kind of middle ground where the refugees and the asylum seekers can have some kind of right. And back to your question, there have been experiences in Asia where refugee camps at the borders have been managed to a certain degree. I dare not say they were perfect, but
can you give us examples of those camps that you're talking about?
The Burma-Thai border, they were camps which were managed together with civil society, and while they were not perfect, over the years with pressure from different international organizations, the conditions improved. But what happened was the country of where those camps were located gave some space, a bit more extra space than others, to ensure that the people there had more protection. So there are ways to negotiate and ensure that conditions keep increasing or improving. But I think I can't compare the Thai-Myanmar border to what's happening in Greece. It's a totally different ballgame. But the pressure has to continue. And EU has to work faster. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to suffer and die unnecessarily. Yeah, people are not pawns. They're not political pawns to be used in your as bargaining chips between in the geopolitics. Yeah.
Mr. Alireza, Yasa, do you feel like these refugees who are coming to Europe for shelter are being used as pawns, are being used as chips in a wider game between different EU states, and not just EU states, but the entire region?
It's not only one country's like Europe or some other country responsibility. It's a global crisis in the world. That's why the global compact is started to be done by UNHCR or other.
But the global compact didn't have much success. It didn't have much success. We saw protests all across the world just for sitting at the table for the conference.
Exactly. That's why we are saying that this is a global crisis, that every country has responsibility to make a solution for this crisis of human being, like refugees. So in this case, it's not only a responsibility of the Greece, it's only not responsibility of UNHCR. All the world, all the countries who are committed to the UNHCR and this global compact, they are responsible against this crisis. They must do something. They must open the doors, or they must make a solution for these refugees, that for this much number of human, to make a little change and to be care about the human rights which is going down.
Right. Mr. Alireza, Yasa, ever since Turkey opened its borders for refugees to move towards Europe, Greece has suspended accepting asylum requests. Now, how do you think this will make the situation worse? What is to be expected in the next coming months?
Unfortunately, it's another crisis in Turkey as well. They opened their border. For example, Turkey government is saying that we are opening our border through the Europe. But the Europe, especially the border of Turkey, like Greece and Bulgaria, they are closing much more. 5,000 arms are coming near to the border, near to the doors, to ban the ways, to ban the gates on face of the refugees. It's a kind of, I think it's a kind of political issues between Turkey and European Union. They must solve their problems and do not use humans like refugee to pushing each other.
Right.
Of course, both sides should make a decision to make a little managing of this crisis. That's why the refugees are being used, even in Greece, European Union, and also in Turkey as well.
Right. Mr. Adrian Pereira, talk about the conditions of these refugees, which is quite terrible, honestly. And it seems like there is a deadlock amongst countries and nations in deciding what to do, how the game plan should be from that point onwards. You mentioned about the wider international community, so did Mr. Yasa. Can NGOs and other fundings, other organizations play a role in any of this?
I think they can play a role, but it's still a very limited role as observers and maybe filling some of the charity gaps. But this is not a question of charity. This is a question of social justice. Nobody wants to talk about the the effects of colonialism in the countries where the refugees are coming from. It's a very mixed migration situation.
Right.
We must also address the economic situation in some of the African countries where the refugees are also coming into Greece. So nobody wants to address those root causes. And NGOs, I really don't have much hope in NGOs, even though I'm running one myself.
Right. Of course, as you're saying, their role seems to be limited in this game, which is of wider politics, is of deeper concerns, and which national actors need to tend to if we want to find a peaceful solution and want to hope for the prosperity of all these refugees that are fleeing war and conflict. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Adrian Pereira, for joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Mr. Alireza Yasa for joining us from Istanbul. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at how the perception of refugees is shifting all across Europe. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show. Now, the number of refugees entering Europe or trying to enter Europe is nowhere near the number back in 2015. But it seems like the words for refugees and the attitude towards them is becoming more harsh. Is Europe keeping up with its humanitarian obligations? Let's discuss this further. Joining us is Mr. Dimitris, Skleparis, a research fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and he specializes in security of migration and the politics of migrant activism. He joins us from Newcastle. Also joining us today is Dr. Uli Brueckner, who joins us from Berlin. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for taking out the time. Mr. Skleparis, let me begin with you. Now, when you witness the narrative regarding migration, but specifically refugees, that has developed and changed since 2015 in Europe, what do you feel like are the main changes?
Hi from Newcastle. So what the main change is basically the fact that there is no different voice at the moment in Europe. So there is no difference in terms of the voices that we hear in Europe that was prevalent in 2015. So in 2015, there were two different dominant voices, let's say. The welcoming voice, the voice of human rights, the voice that was welcoming to refugees and migrants, and the voice that was restrictive towards them. This time around, things have changed, and the voice in Europe seems to be more unified. It's a predominant voice is the voice of restriction towards migration.
Right. Dr. Uli Brueckner, we are seeing that more and more expenditure, Amnesty International also documented this, is going into building fences, surveillance systems, and almost to try to keep refugees out from entering Europe. Do you agree with that the voice is now unified all across Europe, which is let's increase the restrictions?
In my opinion, this is way too one-sided. Of course, we currently look at the terrible humanitarian situation at the Greek-Turkish border, and that looks as if Europe turned into a fortress. But when we look at the numbers, we still see hundreds of thousands of successful applications last year and the year before. Of course, the situation is different in the peak of asylum applications in 2015 and 16, but Europe is far from being a fortress. It does more in border protection, which is an integral part of its migration policy, but it would be one-sided to say that neither is there another voice, nor is there anything Europe is doing at the moment.
Right. So you're saying that it is a misportrayal of sorts to say that it has become a fortress given the current situation, but do you believe Europe is still welcoming?
What we saw in 2015 was mostly a unilateral act by the German government, which is still by far the #1 country of receiving asylum applications. It stands for something like 50% of the total number of asylum seekers. And Angela Merkel, who's still the German chancellor until next year, she unilaterally decided that out of a humanitarian act, she accepts applications despite what the Dublin Agreement defines as the legal framework for asylum applications in Germany. She believed that this unilateral step could lead to an integrated European migration policy, which did not happen in 2015, and we are still far from having an integrated approach.
Right. Mr. Skleparis, that's an essential point that's brought up. Having an approach, having a coherent policy on how EU members all across the board are going to deal with this issue of the incoming refugees. What do you think has created the major roadblock to actually mapping something out which works for everyone?
The main problem here is that although there is a system in place, the Common European Asylum System in place, which prescribes certain provisions and certain obligations on behalf of different EU member states, the main problem is that there is no mechanism to enforce these kind of decisions. So there is no mechanism in place to enforce compliance of EU member states to these kinds of prescriptions by the Common European Asylum System. And this is, for example, for me, it's very interesting to see in juxtaposition with the economic crisis in Europe, how austerity measures, for example, were imposed and enforced on countries in the south of Europe, whereas when it comes to the implementation of policies that have to do with migrants and refugees, there is no such mechanism of enforcement in place. So basically, certain EU member states are free riding when it comes to asylum policies in Europe.
Right. Dr. Brueckner, do you agree with that there is an interesting case to be made here, that policies that do need or do want to be implemented, there is a mechanism available and they are enforced. But policies like this just don't have the political will or the political backing to be implemented.
I think it is misleading to compare the two types of crises. The financial crisis before the so-called refugee crisis, which I don't think is the right term because it wasn't a crisis of refugees. It was a crisis of a lack of infrastructure in Europe to deal with such a large number. The main difference is that it's not so much a lack of mechanism and the enforcement of the mechanism, but as you rightly say, a problem of the political will. And in the situation of the financial crisis, countries that overspent and needed financial support from other Eurozone members had to accept the conditions of the lenders to get some financial aid in return for structural reforms that have been enforced in those countries. If we compare this with the situation of those that are considered free riders of the current situation, then neither Poland or Hungary, as the forerunners of those who have a government that has quite a xenophobic rhetoric at the moment, they have never really faced anything like an influx of foreigners. And so the society is far more conservative than what we experience in a much more liberal and multicultural country like Germany. And therefore, there is no leverage to tell them that they should rethink the composition of their society. And the vast majority of people there are not ready yet for something like a multicultural, liberal situation that we experience in a city like Berlin.
Right. Mr. Dimitris, Skleparis, now you work a lot with the security of migration and the politics that surrounds them. One issue is, of course, about the incoming number of refugees, but then there is also a discussion to be had about the refugees that Europe has already accepted. Is it providing them with ample security? Now, we discussed earlier in the show the case of Greece's refugee camp, which seems to be overflowing. The conditions seem to be hellish there. In that sense as well, is Europe living up to its obligations?
Definitely, there are two or more different Europes in this context. So we definitely have the Europe that we see at the external borders of the Union, like what is happening in Greece. But even within Greece, the response has not been uniform. So what we have on the islands, for example, is a completely different situation from the one we have in mainland Greece. And this not only has to do with the different policies and legislations that apply, because on the islands we have an exceptional asylum system that is in place, but it also has to do with the different mentality and the different political will that is in place. So when it comes to migrants, to asylum seekers and refugees in mainland Greece, there have definitely been steps towards their integration. And of course, we have to take into consideration the limited capacity and limited resources of the Greek state in doing that. But when it comes on the Greek islands, for example, then not only there is no political will to integrate these people, but the actual will at the moment is to process their applications as fast as possible and in order to facilitate their deportation to Turkey. And of course, this is only one case in the EU. We can see similar examples of non-uniform effects in terms of integration, I think, in all EU member states. The UK is another example that one could talk about.
Right. Mr. Skleparis, I want to up on that a little more during the show. The fact that different laws and a different asylum system seems to be in place in this island. But just before that, Dr. Uli Brueckner, now many migrant economists have increasingly started supporting the fact, increasingly started putting evidence out for the fact that having more refugees, having more migrants, integration of them actually is beneficial to the economy. You earlier stated the case of Germany. That is one shining example of that as well. In the process of integration, are enough policies there to facilitate taking in the potential that these refugees bring?
I think it is way too early to summarize what the economic effect or the socio-cultural effect of immigration after the years 2015 is. When you look at the demography of migrants,
well, we can extrapolate from cases that are happening other places in the world. Many studies are pointing out towards the benefits of, for instance, migrants in the United States, and that being applied here. Can we not make statements from that?
Well, first of all, these are people who come from war zones. They have been tortured. They have been excluded from access to education. So we speak about a lot of traumatized people who suffered a lot. These are not perfectly trained experts that a German labor market could easily absorb, as we absorbed people with an academic degree coming from the periphery of the Eurozone after the financial crisis. This is relatively easy and also warmly welcomed by the German economic system, which is fundamentally different from migrants who are infants, and we don't know yet how they perform in the educational system and what jobs they are looking for. We see a larger majority of younger people, like most of them are younger than 30, so there is a fair chance that they could be successfully integrated if they use the opportunities right. But it's also a situation that each and every part of Germany provides different systems, since we are a federal republic, and Bavaria, for example, has a very different integration approach than the city of Berlin, for example. So it is too early to tell what the economic impact is, and maybe it takes 2 or 3 generations to have a picture of, yes, it's going to be beneficial, and the 20-something billion that Germany provides at the moment to support the integration process is well invested money.
Right.
But this is not the number one perspective. It's first and foremost a humanitarian act to give people a helping hand who are in need, and not so much that Germany opens its borders in order to rebalance its demographic structure.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Uli Brueckner, for taking the time and talking to us from Berlin. Mr. Dimitris, Skleparis, do you agree with the fact that, as Dr. Uli Brueckner put forth, that it's too early to assume the economic impact that these refugees have on the economy?
Yes, I definitely agree with this argument, and I definitely agree with the fact that this is first and foremost an issue of human rights, and to a lesser extent an issue of demographic change or demographic boost of a country, or maybe contribution to the labor market.
I specifically put this question, Mr. Skleparis, sorry to interject here, because it seems like many governments across Europe use this precise argument that it will be damaging to the economy to bring in refugees, and they use that in order to mobilize support for pushing refugees out or placing greater restrictions on their entrance. So where do we find a balance in this? If it's too early to see the economic impact of what will be done when these refugees are accepted, why is there so much political rhetoric surrounding that?
So on the one hand, it has to do with the fact that states in the West are feeling that they're losing their sovereignty, so their right to control their borders and who to allow entrance, which has to do with is in stark conflict with their obligations. This is what they think, right? Their obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights, for example, their obligation to accept refugees. So you have this kind of conflict between the norm of sovereignty and the norm of human rights obligations. But on the other hand, you also have the issue that these people, refugees, based on studies, will start contributing to the economy maybe after the first 4 or 5 years. Up to that point, these people will essentially need support. So will essentially need from the state, from the host state, to invest resources into them in order to be able to make a contribution. But studies find that after the 4 or 5 year threshold, refugees contribute to the economy.
Right. On that point, I also want to introduce Mr. Farshid Ariyan, who is a lawyer and a human rights activist who has worked extensively on the refugee crisis. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Mr. Ariyan, for joining us, and welcome to the show. As we've been talking about the debate between if we cannot begin to assume or begin to really tell if refugees will have a positive impact on the economy, how do we go so quick to judge and say that they will be bad for the economy and use that as a political rhetoric to push them out? Do you in fact believe that asylum seekers and their requests have gone down in the recent years because of this political rhetoric?
I've been working with refugees in years. I mean, since 1986, 7. We could say I used to work in the UNHCR in Turkey as a refugee myself. So, and I've been within this crisis, negotiating sometimes even with European Union. I went to Cyprus a couple of years ago and Greece. Talking to the authorities of Cyprus and also Greece about the way they handle refugee crisis and so on and so on. The question, answering your question about, look, we know it has been a long time that any political party in Europe, because of the populism and the popular, being popular to raise the question about race and refugees, this rhetoric is really the audience and the voters buy it well, because anytime they have a crisis because of the mismanagement and any shortfall, they put it on the shoulder of the refugees. Obviously, they are not recognizing how important it is to their economy and as well in another way.
Mr. Ariyan, as we're talking about this political rhetoric, has it translated into actual policies which have seen the deterrence of trying to build up this wall against refugees coming in? Because that's the debate here. That seems to be a confusion. Whether with all this hostile political rhetoric out there, is Europe still keeping up to its humanitarian obligations of letting these refugees in?
Yeah, we are talking about Geneva Convention. We are talking about the whole issue about refugees and also immigrants and their policies with their countries. I have a Persian Iranian background. Imagine European Union all the time, they turn back their head not to see any human rights abuses and the breach of human rights in Iran, and cooperated with Persian Iranian authorities. And then when refugees are leaving the country and coming to their countries, they are talking about these issues. This is exactly about every other country in the Europe. Syria, we could see that how the whole European Union as well as the United States, they really supported different sort of uprising in their country, and they just don't want to have the consequences. We are talking about refugees being a political tool in order to manage or actually to convince the audience or voters all the time.
Right.
When we have got a double morality, let me just finish that. We have got a double morality. From one way, they talk about human rights, they talk about.
And Mr. Ariyan, sorry to interject here, but you mentioned the Geneva Convention and other conventions which make it compulsive for countries to act in a certain way when asylum seekers come to their doors. Also talking about what happens afterwards in the process, are there international laws and international obligations that are put on host countries to ensure that they also fulfill certain basic rights, basic necessities after they've taken in refugees? Are there any laws, any compulsions within the legal architecture?
Yeah, unfortunately, as you could say, when I was studying law in 19s, European Union incorporated Declaration of Human Rights into the European Human Rights Convention, and then they forced United Kingdom to accept it. In 97, United Kingdom would follow because they had a breach of human rights in terms of refugees and the others. We were talking about, as I mentioned, first of all, international law is always has been unable and incapable of, because there's not any authority that could check and balance or control that. United Nations sometimes is or United governments are not. I mean, the representative of governments are not necessarily the representative of the country. And unfortunately, they have no power. The superpowers, the veto right, they have more powers. What I'm trying to say is that we are talking about the word like now in Corona to put your head away.
Mr. Ariyan, since I'm running on time, sorry to interrupt there, but I want to carry on from that point you're making, that these international bodies seem to lack the power that they should in order to actually enforce or implement certain laws, certain legal obligations on countries that are member states of these organizations in the first place. Mr. Dimitris, Skleparis, now what is Europe expecting? What is the game plan in the coming days in terms of the refugees that they will see coming to their borders? We're also seeing hostility at the Greek-Turkish border. Are we going to see that happening also towards the migrants and refugees coming to them from sea, from different areas?
So basically, what the plan is on behalf of the EU is not to let people reach the EU territory in order to be able to apply for asylum. This is what's happening. So because the convention applies from the moment somebody enters the EU territory, and this is when the EU member state, like Greece, for example, has an obligation to accept the asylum application. However, the whole point of the EU migration policy in the last few years, especially after the refugee crisis, is to try to create a buffer zone between the EU and sources of potential forced displacement like Syria. Now, the main problem in this situation that we have now is that Turkey is basically next to Syria, is next to an active war zone, so there is no possibility for the EU in order to extend this kind of buffer zone even further down. Like, for example, what's happening in between Libya and Italy.
Right. Mr. Yasa, I just want to read out these figures by the UN, which talks about the refugees crossing sea, which was almost 63,000 in 2019, and almost 1,028 individuals so far were seen to have drowned while trying to cross sea and make it to Europe. Now, you mentioned here that the game plan seems to not let the refugees in the first place get to the borders, because that's when the legal obligations begin, that's when the process begins. So is Europe fine having all these refugees drown in the sea?
No, I don't believe that Europe wants to see this kind of thing. And as far as I know, in the meeting that President Erdogan had in Brussels, a couple of days ago, it was agreed that Turkey will do whatever it takes to stop people from leaving the Turkish coast. However, I'm not sure if a similar kind of commitment was made when it comes to the land border between
But people
Greece
will
and Turkey.
still be crossing the Mediterranean Sea. There will still be lives at stake. Will there not be rescue guards, sea guards in the patrol area there to save these people that are coming on these boats with great insecurity?
The main problem is that in the last few years after the so-called refugee crisis, all rescue operations, be it state-initiated rescue operations or civil society-initiated rescue operations, have all been securitized. So these kinds of operations are considered by EU officials as pull factors towards Europe, because supposedly migrants know that in their attempts to cross to Europe, they will eventually be saved, and eventually the EU law will be applicable on them, which creates the major problem that you described of the large amounts of casualties and missing persons that we have in the Mediterranean.
Right. On that point, it seems like the European Union is more concerned with the crisis at its borders than the actual crisis, which is happening in Syria, happening in various conflict zones around the world. And these people want to seek asylum, want to come to shore, want to get to land with their family, with their children. But we're just going to have to wait and see how the situation unfolds. Thank you so much, Mr. Dimitris Skleparis, for joining us from Newcastle. Farshid, Ariyan, for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.